This is about the fighting in Normandy after D-Day. It's about tactics and command and courage and sacrifice. In the 3 weeks after the landings, the Allies landed 1,000,000 men, 560,000 tons of supplies, and 150,000 vehicles. They carved out space around the landing beaches, cleared the Cotentin Peninsula, and captured the port at Cherbourg. From there, they planned to move east towards Paris and the River Seine, and west into Brittany. While the British fought the Germans for Caen in the east, it was up to the American First Army to break through the German defenses in the west. General Omar Bradley commanded the U.S. First Army. He had about 170,000 men in 13 divisions, 11 infantry, 1 airborne, and 1 armored. Bradley named the Coutances-Saint-Lô-Caumont line as the objective of an attack that started on July 3rd. From there, the First Army would start its breakout across France. At the west end of the line, it was about 22 miles from the American positions to Coutances. In the center, it was 5 miles to Saint-Lô, and in the east, 3 miles to Caumont. Standing between the First Army and its objective were about 56,000 soldiers of the German 7th Army in 8 divisions, 6 infantry divisions on the line at the outset of the American attack, and 2 armored divisions on the way. When Bradley called an end to it on July 20th, the First Army attack was far from its objectives. The Americans took Caumont in the east and Saint-Lô near the center, but everywhere else they were held north of the Laissé-Perrier-Saint-Lô-Caumont road, 12 miles short of Coutances. Everyone on the American side blamed the hedgerows. Stretching south for miles from the landing beaches was country the French called the Bocage. An American officer described it as 10,000 tiny pastures, girdled by sunken lanes the width of an ox cart and enclosed with man-high hedgerows of thatched hawthorn roots, raspberry bushes, lupine, violets, and greasy mud. This is a lane that runs between hedgerows in the Bocage. A hedgerow is a fence, half earth and half hedge. The base is a dirt bank roughly 3 feet thick and 6 feet high. Growing out of that is a tangled hedge about 2 feet thick and 10 feet high. The hedgerows were ready-made strong points for German defenders. And the Germans made the most of them. They burrowed deep behind the hedgerows to shelter from American artillery, and they hid their guns in them to fire on U.S. infantry. This is a typical field in the Bocage. It's about 300 yards wide and 200 yards long, with a dirt lane running along one side. The Germans usually defended a field like this with a squad of soldiers made up of a machine gun team, 4 riflemen, an anti-tank man, and a leader. This squad has help from a second machine gun from its platoon headquarters. The machine guns cover the field in a crossfire, the anti-tank man covers the lane, and the riflemen cover the middle of the field. The squad also has support from as many as 5 of its battalion's mortars, with preset targets ready to fire when the squad leader signals. At first, the Americans attack a field like this with a platoon of 3 squads. A U.S. infantry squad has an automatic rifle team, 8 riflemen, and a leader. There are 2 squads in the lead and another following behind, along with the platoon commander. The platoon doesn't have help from a machine gun. By one officer's account, machine guns were almost useless in the attack. The only way to get them into position was to set them on top of a hedgerow bank. That was not good, because the German was in the next bank and got you before you set the gun down. The platoon can't get help from mortars. At ranges of 300 yards or less, mortar fire is more dangerous to the American troops crossing the field in the open than to the Germans dug into the hedgerows. So the attackers try to use surprise and cross the field in a rush that gives the Germans no time to open fire. But surprise rarely worked. As an American officer described it, we could not get through the hedge without hacking a way through. It took time for the infantryman to climb up the bank and scramble over, during which time he was a luscious target, and when he got over, the Germans knew just where he was. American squads that try to take a field in a rush are hit by German machine gun fire. U.S. soldiers that survive the enemy machine guns and go to ground out in the field or take shelter back behind their hedgerows are punished by German mortar fire. The attack fails. Without surprise, the attackers had to rely on their own automatic rifles and rifles to knock out defenders or force them to take cover so they could cross the open ground and get close enough to finish the enemy off or drive them away. But firepower didn't work either. A German squad defending the field with 2 machine guns, 5 rifles, and 1 machine pistol could fire as many as 2,975 rounds a minute. 2 American squads attacking the field with 2 automatic rifles and 16 rifles could fire only as many as 2,100 rounds a minute. In reality, no one could manage maximum firepower for long, if at all. Reloading, overheating weapons, and above all, casualties, kept any infantry unit's fire well below the top rate. But even at half strength, a German squad with an extra machine gun could put out up to 2,400 rounds a minute. At half strength, 2 American squads with both their automatic rifles could fire 1,700 rounds a minute. Almost always, the Americans were outgunned. Another way to attack was to send one squad through a gap in the hedgerows, while another squad tried to beat down the German machine guns with fire of their own. But in the words of that same American officer, our infantry could attempt to get through the gaps in the hedgerows and crawl up along the row leading forward, but the Germans knew about the gaps before we did, and were usually prepared with machine gun reception committees. In this attack, one U.S. squad fires on the Germans across the field, trying to hit them or force them down into their fighting holes, while another squad waits to attack through the gap in the hedgerow where the lane comes through. The rest of the platoon is back in reserve, but the German machine guns have enough firepower to force the Americans to stop firing and drop behind their hedgerow. Without fire from the covering squad, the attacking squad is caught in the open by German machine gun fire from the far corner of the field. The attack fails. The solution the Americans turned to was tanks. Each infantry division had 68 tanks. American commanders started using them in the fight for the hedgerows, but there was trouble getting tanks and infantry to work together well. In this attack, one U.S. squad fires on the Germans across the field, while a tank and another squad wait to attack through the gap in the hedgerow. The rest of the platoon is back in reserve, but even a single German machine gun has enough firepower to drive the Americans back behind their hedgerow. When the American tank moves into the field without covering fire, it's an easy target for the German anti-tank man, already in position to fire down the lane. Without the tank to protect them, the squad attacking through the gap is caught in the open by German machine gun fire. The attack fails. American tanks could not attack across an open field unless the German anti-tank weapons were knocked down or out, and no one could attack through the standing gaps in the hedgerows where the Germans were ready for them. American units struggled to find a way to win the close fight in the hedgerows. It took them 3 weeks to figure out how. They welded steel teeth to a tank to make a hedge cutter with tusk-like prongs. Called rhinos, tanks with these tusks could break through any place in a hedgerow bank. First Army converted 3 out of every 5 of its tanks to rhinos by the end of July. In this attack, a rhino tank breaks through the hedgerow where the German anti-tank man isn't expecting it. It fires into the far corners of the field, knocking out the German machine guns and forcing the anti-tank man to take cover. Then it uses its own machine guns to pin down the German anti-tank man and the rifleman. An American rifle squad moves through the hedgerow, crosses the field, and kills the German defenders or drives them away. The attack succeeds. The Americans started making progress through the Bocage, but it was a bitter slog. The Germans used the hedgerows in depth, in lines of defense one in front of the other, about 500 yards apart, with strong points in between. These are typical German defenses near Saint-Lô, held by part of a battalion-sized battle group. In an area 800 yards by 500 yards, the Germans had 54 machine guns, 40 anti-tank weapons, and 120 fighting holes dug into the hedgerows, ready for the Americans to come at them down the lanes or across the fields. To know how hard this was on the First Army, it's important to grasp the difference between a unit's manpower and its fighting strength. The division was the basic fighting unit of World War II armies. Some of the men in a division were in close combat jobs, where they came under direct enemy sight or fire almost all the time. The rest rarely did. In a full-strength U.S. infantry division, there were only about 7,200 close combat fighters. In a fully manned armored division, there were only about 5,300. That meant it was easy for a division to run out of fighting men. 1,000 casualties a day would use up an infantry division in a week, unless there were replacements. And new men just weren't as effective as experienced soldiers, so even with replacements, the combat power of a division could fall a lot in only a few days of hard fighting. And the fight in the hedgerows was very hard. As an American soldier said, it seemed like the end of everything. There was no memory of anything before being here under fire. The 83rd Division had 5,000 casualties, 70% of its close combat strength. The 90th Division had 5,500 casualties. That was 76% of its close combat strength. But some of its units suffered much more. One of its infantry battalions was left with 82 men out of an original strength of 860 after 12 days of fighting. The 29th Division's 3,000 casualties were 42% of its close combat strength, but one of its battalions lost 80% of its men. It was difficult to gain so little and lose so much. A U.S. general put it this way: there was so little result to show for so much suffering, just a few hedgerows gained, each one just like those already behind, and those still to take. U.S. commanders blamed the hedgerows. They said it was natural country for the defense, ready-made for fighting from cover and easy to defend in depth. But the Bocage was tough to defend. It closed fields of fire from mortars and machine guns down to only a few hundred yards, and it broke the battle into scores of small fights that were hard to command. And no matter where they were, The deserts of North Africa, the mountains of Italy, the steppes of Russia, or the hedgerows of France, the Germans fought from well prepared positions and in lines of defense, one behind the other. U.S. commanders blamed their soldiers. They said American infantrymen did not use their weapons well, that they froze under fire, that they weren't well trained. But the generals were wrong. The real problem was that American troops were outgunned. Hit with machine gun fire they couldn't counter with their own weapons, U.S. soldiers, new to battle or blooded veterans, took cover. Pounded by mortars when they did, there was hardly anything they could do but duck and stop shooting. The U.S. Army had been in combat against the Germans for 18 months before the campaign in Normandy. American commanders knew from North Africa, Sicily, and Italy that their soldiers had trouble winning the close fight on their own, and problems working with the tanks sent to help them. But they sent their troops into battle in the Bocage without the firepower they needed and without training in fighting alongside tanks. The U.S. infantry won the battle in the Bocage. On their own, American soldiers figured out the tactics that worked against the Germans, but some 50,000 of them were killed, wounded, or broken while they did. It's hard to understand how their commanders could let that happen. Were they as callous as Omar Bradley seems to be in this quote? Were they too busy planning the D-Day landings to think about the next part of the fight? Or were they blind to the importance of weapons and tactics in the squads, platoons, and companies where the hard fighting occurs? Whatever the reason, it was soldiers like this who paid the price. The command lesson from the Normandy campaign is that strategy without tactics is not just the slowest route to victory, it's the bloodiest. Bradley was right. Soldiers are tools in the hands of their commanders. But commanders have a duty not just to win with those tools, but to make them as good as they can be and use them as well as they can.